大家好，这里是听广播学英语频道。移民问题为何如此重要？移民是选民关注的主要问题之一，因为它涉及政治、情感和制度问题。因素包括边境危机、寻求庇护者以及贫困和气候的影响。好了，到底这里面的真相是什么呢
？One of the top issues on voters' minds, according to a recent poll from Gallup, is immigration.
What happens at the border is often seen through the lens of politics.
The system is so broken. It is so outdated.
There is no issue that I can think of that has been so emotional, so divisive, just kind of wrenching for people emotionally and politically than immigration.
We've heard rhetoric about a crisis at the border and a surge of migrants pouring into the U.S. What's been going on at the southern border? Why is undocumented immigration a key election issue, and how can we improve our immigration system? I'm NPR immigration correspondent Jasmine Garst, and this is NPR Explains Immigration. Stay with us. A record number of undocumented people crossed the U.S.-Mexico border in December. Illegal crossings have since dropped, but analysts say war, poverty, and climate factors will continue to bring people to the border. I spoke with Erin Reichlin-Melnick, policy director at the American Immigration Council, a nonpartisan group that seeks to solve immigration policy problems.
Over the last decade, there have been a lot more asylum seekers showing up at the border. In 2013, it was mostly people fleeing horrific violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Then we saw in 2021, we started seeing more people coming from South America, an influx of Venezuelans and people coming from further abroad. And in 2023, 2024, we're starting to see what's been called extracontinental migration, migrants arriving from Africa and Asia in numbers that are higher than before.
Something I've noticed working on the border quite a bit in the last 2 years is a shift to more migrants and asylum seekers who are middle class and educated. I've interviewed a lot more migrants who are, solar energy specialist from Brazil, a doctor from Chad, a physical therapy student from Venezuela. These are actual real examples of people who I've spoken to.
Oh, yeah. A lot of this, for example, when you look at Venezuela and Nicaragua, countries that have seen sort of collapses as regimes tighten their grasp and push out a lot of political opponents. Well, a lot of political opponents, people who get involved in politics, are often educated professionals. So Venezuela in particular, 1 in 4 people have left Venezuela in the last decade. 7.7 million people have fled the country since 2013, 2014. But the U.S. legal immigration system hasn't been updated since 1990. It is a backlogged, archaic, antiquated mess of a system that does not offer a path to come here for most people in the world, even educated professionals like doctors. And that means that for many people, the only door to come here is the asylum door.
Define asylum. What is asylum in the U.S.?
So asylum is a form of protection that's available to people who can prove that they are refugees. And crucially, asylum is only for people who are here already. The big distinction in the U.S. system is between a refugee and an asylee. A refugee is a person who has been determined to be a refugee outside of the United States. They were maybe in a refugee camp. They were wherever they were around the world. They went through a process. We determined you are a refugee and we will let you come here to the country. And so with refugees who are adjudicated overseas, they arrive here having already won their case. Asylum seekers arrive here and say, don't send me back. Why? Because I fit the definition of a refugee, which is a person with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. At its core, asylum is about a basic acknowledgement that the government should never send someone back to their deaths or their jailing or their persecution if possible. And it comes from what happened before the Holocaust. In the 1930s, the United States and countries around the world turned away Jews who had seen the writing on the wall and decided to get out early. The MS St. Louis is the most famous example of this. It was a ship filled with Jews who were fleeing Germany in 1939. And they came to the United States on a boat, and the United States said, "We are not allowing you in." In fact, the United States at the time was very deliberately trying to keep Jews out. And many, many countries turned away Jews and said, "No, we will not let you come here." And a lot of those Jews ended up going back to Germany and killed in the Holocaust. So when we look at this question of why do we have asylum, it's for people who can see the writing on the wall and can get out before everything that happened then happened. And that's why when we look at asylum, it's about a well-founded fear of persecution. It's not about if you go back, you will be immediately persecuted. It is future-looking. It is what will happen if we send you back.
I've spent some time in communities, camps, detention camps, outdoor detention camps, where people cross the border, turn themselves in. What is happening there when someone is detained and then released?
Once somebody has already entered the United States, they've already taken a step across the border, whatever that may be. They've waded across the Rio Grande, they've climbed over a border wall, they've gone around a border wall, or they're just crossing in one of the areas where there are no border walls. Once they are in the United States, from the U.S. government perspective, they are approached as how can we remove this person? How can we deport this person? Because that person has technically violated immigration law. And there's really two ways to do that. There's a process known as expedited removal, which Congress created in 1996, and there is immigration court, which is the regular removal system. Now, in the removal system, both expedited and regular, asylum is a built-in protection against being removed. In the expedited removal process, there is this thing called a credible fear interview, and that is supposed to be the process by which people who cross the border get put through to determine whether or not their asylum claim basically passes a smell test. Is it a claim that seems like it might produce a positive result, or is it something that, no matter how you look at it, this is not a winner of a claim? This is somebody who just, for whatever reason, either they just don't actually have any fear, they're not afraid of anything, or maybe for whatever reason, the thing they're afraid of doesn't count under U.S. asylum law.
So you cross the border, turn yourselves in, and then you get this expedited removal.
Yeah, so that's how the process is supposed to work. And This is the key. In order to do this credible fear interview that is part of the expedited, the fast removal part, you need asylum officers. And asylum officers are the people who give a migrant a credible fear interview, which is this essentially this smell test. Is your claim, does it pass the smell test or not? There are only nationwide about 800 asylum officers, and each credible fear interview takes anywhere between 1 to 4 hours. And after the interview is done, the asylum officer has to do the paperwork, they have to write it up, they might have to run it by a supervisor. So realistically, asylum officers can do 1, maybe 2 credible fear interviews a day. So right now, with the numbers of people crossing, the U.S. government cannot put everyone through a credible fear interview. And so when you can't do that, that means you just skip the credible fear interview entirely and you go straight to the older immigration court process. And this is where people end up waiting in backlogs of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And that is what is actually happening to most migrants crossing the border. They are not even getting this smell test, not because the U.S. government doesn't want to do these credible fear interviews. In fact, the Biden administration is doing more of these credible fear interviews than any administration in history. But there just aren't enough asylum officers to do them. And in those circumstances, what the U.S. government has been doing since Obama, since under the Trump administration as well, is when the resources aren't there, the only other option is to simply put people in the long, long line that is immigration court. And that usually means we're going to have to release you and you're going to have to go into a line. You're going to sit in the back of this line for 5 years. And at the end of this process, we're going to either issue a removal order or we're going to grant you some form of status.
And you might remember that a bipartisan plan to address border control policy was blocked by Senate Republicans in February after former President Trump publicly opposed the deal. Meanwhile, the Biden administration recently proposed a rule change meant to fast-track deportations for some migrants who pose national security risks.
When you actually look at the polling, consistently over, decades now, the majority of the American public, a strong majority of the American public, supports some form of path to legal status for long-term undocumented immigrants. There has consistently bipartisan agreement that Congress should provide people who have been here for years, not getting into trouble, just working hard, raising families, being members of their community, that we should give them a path to legal status. And yet, that has become the issue that really divides the parties. But when you talk to the average American, their views on it are a lot more nuanced. And their views of it generally boil down to, we want a path to legal status plus enforcement. People still want to view the United States as a just nation, one that offers people second chances and to sort of get right with the law. And yet, despite this widespread agreement, Congress has been totally incapable of actually codifying that into law due to politics.
That's Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Policy Director at the American Immigration Council. Immigration analysts project an increase of people trying to cross into the U.S. in the coming months. And that's despite a heavily fortified border with Mexico. NPR's Sergio Martinez Beltran spoke with Morning Edition host A. Martinez in April.
So what is the basis for this projection? How do analysts know that migrants will continue to arrive at the border?
Weather seasons traditionally dictate migration patterns, and warmer months means more migrants coming. But even more important than that, these experts are seeing an increase in the number of people traveling through the Darien Gap. That's the 100-mile-long jungle between Colombia and Panama. This year, Panama has seen an increase in crossings. Ariel Risotto is senior policy analyst with the Migration Policy Institute, and he's been paying attention to these areas.
And we've seen that in the Darien, slowly the numbers of Venezuelans had been increasing, and we would expect that some of them would also potentially slowly make it over to the United States.
2 out of 3 migrants crossing through the jungle are from Venezuela.
And what do we know about the people showing up at the U.S. southern border?
Well, most of the migrants crossing the southern border are from Mexico, and a majority are family units. That is, at least a minor accompanied by a parent or a legal guardian. The latest report by U.S. Customs and Border Protection show Venezuelans are the second largest group of migrants crossing, and most of them are single adults. Now, beyond Mexico and Venezuela, people from Guatemala, Honduras, and Cuba continue to show up at the border.
So tell us more about those numbers at the southern border. You're in Texas, Sergio. What are you seeing?
What's interesting is where along the southern border migrants are crossing. The Tucson sector in Arizona has seen more crossings than any other sector in the southern border. Last year, it was through Texas. And this shift is palpable. I was in Eagle Pass, right in the Rio Grande, and I talked to folks who assist migrants, and they said it's been pretty quiet lately. Now, if you ask Texas officials, they tell you the shift is due to the state's Operation Lone Star Border Security Initiative, which was launched in 2021. Texas has spent over $11 billion trying to stop illegal crossings by deploying the state National Guard and lining up razor wire in sections of the Rio Grande. But analysts say it might be too early to know if all these efforts are actually having an impact, considering that Texas saw the highest number of illegal crossings last year.
What's been Mexico's role in all this?
Right, so Mexico has ramped up its border enforcement. It commissioned its National Guard to patrol its borders with Guatemala and the U.S., and that has disrupted the flow of migrants. Late last year, Mexico restarted repatriation flights to Venezuela, and last month it announced a plan to provide a stipend for Venezuelans who choose to return to their country and work for certain participating companies there. Now, an analysis by the Washington Office on Latin America found there are still a lot of Venezuelans and migrants from other countries who are stuck in Mexico, but their ultimate destination is still the U.S. So those numbers are not reflected yet.
All right, that's NPR's Sergio Martinez Beltran. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.